Hello and welcome back to the show. My name is Sam and this is The Lonely Chapter. On this podcast, I speak to interesting people extracting their stories, the lessons they've learned along the way, and their knowledge in order for you to find value from it. Thank you for listening. This one was made for your enjoyment. There was a study in 2021 in America where they found that 30 years ago, 55% of men had 6 or more close friends. This is now halved, and only 27% would say the same. 15% of men would say they have no close friends, which is 500% up over the 30 years. It's important to note as well, before we speak, is the women's loneliness has gone the same way, but it's not quite to the same level. Men's is much steeper. Why do you think men are feeling so lonely at the minute?
I mean, really much quite esoteric in terms of every single man probably feels lonely for a different reason. But there are probably some universal causes that do impact a lot of men. And I feel like there's a lot of shame around men bonding over men. There's been a lot of male spaces closed down and boy spaces, things like Boy Scouts of America, most recently renamed Scouting America. And there's various sort of male spaces either closed or heavily vilified, stigmatized. And just the concept of men spending time together is often seen as a very shameful, misogynistic, dangerous thing, which it is not inherently. And then, of course, we're spending more time on our phones, playing computer games, talking to people like this, not, with our mates in the park. And obviously that impacts both people. But I think social media has probably done a fair amount to make everyone feel more lonely. But the issue I find most depressing around loneliness is, like I said, the vilification of the very thing that might actually help men feel less lonely and reduce the male suicide rate. And that is basically people that hate the idea of men spending time with other men. Like there was that study by Robert Dunbar, who is the creator of Dunbar's number, which is a very interesting theory, that found that men need to spend 2 nights a week with other men for their physical mental health. And which is, an interesting finding. I'm not sure about how accurate the study was, but the thing I found most interesting were the comments, the people's responses, which is normally a bunch of very fragile, narcissistic women that were just like, men need more time with their friends. Oh my God. Well, women need 7 nights a week. Oh yeah, that's what men need. Spend 2 nights without their kids and wife and da-da-da-da. And this is just how to ruin a marriage. This is how to ruin a family. This is how to this, that. Basically making it all about themselves. And the point of the message being that men are not spending enough time with their friends or other men, and they need to spend 2 nights a week, recommended, with their friends, their male friends, to help their physical mental health. Doesn't mean they're going to the pub and getting pissed up. It could be like this. It could be a computer game. It could be walking in a park. And I don't know about the accuracy of that study, but I do know the response to it was very, very disappointing and sort of symptomatic of a much bigger problem. And that is that a lot of people don't like the idea of men being with other men because they think it's some sort of toxic masculinity HQ where we're planning to how to oppress women and, sort of reform the patriarchy, which is stupid. We do talk about, and honestly, the conversations I have with my friends are just hilarious and nothing like that.
Yeah. I think it shuts down the fix to it as well, doesn't it? Like we talk about men's health and men's mental health being important. We talk that they need to talk more. But when they want to talk to other men more and in a social setting, rather than just sitting in a room and chatting to a therapist, suddenly that's not acceptable.
Well, I think we're on the downward slope now to this problem. I feel like over the past 5 years, certainly 10 years, there's been a massive renaissance of men's groups that have unapologetically opened up and give men a space to talk about these things without any sort of apology whatsoever. So like Andy's Man Club is an amazing example of that. Different spaces, Men's Circle is one I work with, different spaces where every week they'll open a group around the country, lots of them, and it'll be maybe 10 men or maybe fewer, just talking about their life, what they've gone through. And I've sat in one just to observe it. And it was so beautiful. Like I didn't even want to speak. I was like, "Hi, guys, I'm really sorry I'm here. If you want, I can turn my camera off. I just want to watch. I want to listen. I want to learn what this is. I want to see behind the scenes." And then at the end, I'm like, oh, let me tell you about this and that. And this. Can I have my 2 minutes to speak too? And it was such a healing experience. And that is a new thing. And it's not always virtual. Sometimes you go in person. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Very healing for men. And it brings up a question of, is the current traditional form of psychotherapy, which is normally just, you go into a room and speak in a clinical environment in a very sanitized way, normally to a middle-aged woman, is that really as effective on men as it is on women? Because I don't think it is. I think men actually prefer to speak to a man, first of all, not in a clinical environment, in whilst on a walk or on a hike, or playing golf or tennis at the gym, who knows?
Yeah.
And they want to speak with a group of men. Like, men often need to learn from other men on how to communicate through some sort of a male role modeling behavior. And often they might go to one of these groups and they might not say anything for the first week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And they're watching other men, they're learning, they're picking up the skills of emotional eloquence and intelligence. And it's just an amazing thing. And the people I know in male suicide are raving about male groups, men's groups. And the problem is that we just need to ignore these people who see these groups as inherently hostile and toxic, because they're not. They're really, really excellent, and there's nothing to be apologised for.
And I think again, speaking about face-to-face therapy, that can be really difficult for men to look at someone.
Yeah.
And you mentioned walking. Like, I've personally have had some of the best conversations whilst out on runs with friends, and it's that you're both looking forward, you're both working, you're not really thinking about, you're not looking into their eyes. When you're opening up to someone, you don't want to see their reaction almost.
Just look at the body language. When you see two women talking, often they're like this, and they're talking quite a fast rate, whereas men are more often looking at different angles, not facing each other. Whether that's a man thing or a universal thing that men are more subjected to, I don't know. But it's quite clear that men don't want to be sat like this, talking face to face like we are. I'm one of those people. I don't enjoy that. But if we're having a walk or playing a sport at the gym, lifting weights, walking the dog, even driving's good because you're facing forwards. It's so much easier. It takes the pressure off a little bit. And these are the little things that we're slowly seeing brought into therapeutic interventions that are having a massively beneficial effect.
And I had a bit of a period of reflection, because I thought I've had all these setbacks. And one of the setbacks we haven't spoken about actually is I'd applied to another team doing a very similar role, aviation and space, and I didn't get that role. And I didn't get that role because while I was in the top 3 and while I was the most enthusiastic candidate and I'd performed, I think, pretty well on the technical, they were looking for someone who had attended a better university than I had, and someone that had trained at a better firm, and it was rubbish. It's
just how it reads on paper for them.
Yeah, it was absolutely like a person fit rather than maybe a brain fit, and it's sad. And I think, unfortunately, it does go on in the legal profession. We're trying really hard to make it diverse, but I think there will always be cookie cutter positions for people. And it felt really rubbish. But I think because I've been through so many disappointing moments in my life and felt like a failure so many times, it actually didn't hit as hard, this one. And I thought, gosh, it's only taken 28 years for me to be able to deal with this feeling of failure.
Yeah. Well, you've spoken about failure a few times now, and I think that's something, again, which we only learn through failure. And it's horrible to fail because it's the thing that everyone's scared of. Doing anything, just speaking to someone, asking someone on a date, you don't do it because you're scared of being rejected, like as an example. But by failing, you learn it's not that bad. You start learning, okay, what went wrong here? What can I do next time? And then you start to progress. If you're not failing ever, then you're not really putting yourself out there to do anything outside of your comfort zone. And then you don't grow as a person, essentially. So failure is one of those weird things where we look at it as a negative, but actually it's a massive positive, and going through failure makes you a much stronger, resilient person.
Yeah, I do a lot of journaling, and I was journaling about failing, and I got to the point where I wrote, and I wish I brought my journal to read it, because I thought, gosh, this is really great from me. And
You're
said,
so good at this.
Well, because sometimes you feel these feelings and there's a lot more to it, and you can really explore why you feel something. And I got to the point where I said something along the lines of, just turn up in the arena, like just turn up. Because even if you get knocked down, you will make friends with everyone else that's down there with you, and you can together bring yourselves up. And I think failure has a lot of shame attached to it, and I think shame is something that we don't speak about a lot, but that influences us massively. And I think when people feel ashamed, they don't speak honestly, and they don't speak vulnerably. But I think if we were more forthcoming with the shame that we felt and the guilt that we feel, you can actually get to a more positive place. And I think vulnerability is the biggest driver of connection. And that is how my most powerful friendships have been forged, because for example, when I did my final exams to qualify as a solicitor, I had my first ever adult panic attack. And I said to all my friends, oh my gosh, I've just had my first adult panic attack. I feel horrendous. I feel like I am really, really going to fail. And then everyone else was like, oh my gosh, I felt like that too. I felt really, really disheartened by how that went. I don't think I've done very well. But I think it takes just one person to say, this is how I feel. And then 9 times out of 10, someone is going to say, oh my gosh, I felt like that too.
Yeah. It opens up, and it goes back to that time in the lecture hall where you spoke up and no one else did. It's that same thing. You spoke up first and said, I'm feeling this way. It suddenly unlocks everyone else going, oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I've been feeling exactly the same way.
I don't know why we have this shame of judgment. Like, we have this fear of judgment. Yeah. And with that fear of judgment comes shame. So then you hide things that you think people would judge you for. And I don't.
But a lot of the time, it's you telling yourself that other people are going to shame you. And in actual fact, as you found out there, no one shamed you. They actually said, oh, like, I felt the same way.
Yeah.
So it's such a weird thing that we like, the story we tell ourselves in the mind is so rarely, if ever, the same as what's going to happen. So it's fascinating.
Do you know, I did it to myself. I kind of coached myself because I'd applied for this role, and I'm not a very good secret keeper, and I told everybody that I was applying for this role, and it was my dream role, and I didn't get it. And I then had to tell everyone that I didn't get it. And I said to my partner, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to tell everyone that I didn't get my dream role that I'd worked really hard for and that everyone thought I'd get. And I said, but do you know what? I actually am really glad, because at some point, someone I know is going to apply for a job that they really want and they're not going to get it. And in that moment, they're going to go, oh my gosh, I know I should call. I'm going to call Chloe because she knows how this was. And that is so much more important to me than being able to be like, oh my gosh, I got this job. Because it's great. And I did eventually get there, and actually all the same friends were there saying, we knew you would get there. It was just...
And that doubles up as well now, because like you said, they would look at you and see, okay, well, Chloe did fail the first time, but then she went on and she still got it. So there's hope for me yet. And so then they will go on and push.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have like the both sides of it as well.
Yeah, I tell my friends everything, sometimes too much. And I do say to myself all the time, maybe you shouldn't tell your friends like, oh, I've woken up and I feel really weird today, or I've got a headache today, or I've got this today. But I think it makes people more forthcoming with me. Yeah. And my biggest kind of fear is that people feel alone.
Yeah.
And it brings it back to your podcast, The Lonely Chapter. Loneliness can be really powerful in terms of it can encourage you to focus on something, but it doesn't necessarily need to be lonely.
Yeah.
And you can find someone to sit with you in those dark moments. And I think you don't necessarily need to have an answer, or, you know, as humans, we want to say, oh my gosh, it's going to be okay. You don't always need to say that. I think you sometimes can just say, do you know what? That sounds like really shit what you're going through.
Yeah. 100%.
And I'm really sorry. And I'm going to be here for you, and however you want me to be here.
You then took those conversationalist skills or communication skills, if you like, a bit further whilst in the police force. So you went into SWAT hostage negotiating, which sounds really thrilling and quite exciting. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about what that entailed and what that was like?
Sure. So for those of your audience who don't understand how SWAT teams are usually configured, there's usually two groups. There's a tactical team, a group of men and women, and they have all the toys, all the latest guns and the armored cars and, the tear gas and all that kind of stuff. And then there are the negotiators. And we trained together, and we used to joke with the tactical team that if we did our job correctly, you didn't get to use all your toys and things like that. So when there was an opening for the SWAT hostage negotiator, I put in for it. And the reason I did is usually the members of a SWAT team are usually the best officers or the better officers, and they get the best training and the best equipment. And I've always wanted to be part of the best in my life. And so when that opening came available, I said, I'm going to put in for it. But again, I was older. I was easy in my 40s. And there was a physical fitness component of it where you had to, run and do push-ups and sit-ups. You had to meet with we had a psychologist, a department psychologist. You had to meet with him. You had to take psychological exams. You had to meet with the command staff. And then you had to meet with the team. And it was an all or nothing with the team. If one person said, hey, I've worked with Terry before and he's kind of difficult to work with, you didn't get on. So everybody had to give you the thumbs up in order to get on. So I got on. And the way we used to train is we would do scenarios. We would read about other scenarios that other real SWAT teams have been part of, and then we try to recreate that. And then where we learned was in the debrief, because we had a different psychologist that worked with us. And so you might go through something and, the psychologist might say to you, did you ever think that person might have been schizophrenic and off their medication? It's like, oh, no, I never thought about that. So just kind of how we learned. But I'll give you kind of a funny story. So when I first started, my very first scenario, very simple, a hostage and a hostage taker behind a locked door. Sam, I spent the entire time talking to the hostage. And when we were done, they were like, you understand that we're trying to deal with the hostage taker to get the hostage out. You understand? And I was like, yeah, I kind of blew that, didn't I? So I realized that I had a lot to learn when I first started that job.
That's awesome. Do you have any memorable experiences from that time there? Are you I don't know if you're allowed to talk about it, but yeah.
Sure. I can. I mean, it was a long time ago that I did this. Yeah, I did. And I guess let me kind of back up and give you a little bit. So when I first started, they gave us a formula of how we communicate with each other. And by we, I mean human beings, not just police or anything like that. And the formula was 7-38-55. So 7% of how we communicate a message with another person are the words that we use. And think how many times we've been like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or I wish I would have said this differently. That's only 7% of how we communicate a message. 38% is the tone of voice that we use with that message. And then 55% of how we communicate a message is our body language and our facial expressions. So understanding that, realizing that if I'm negotiating with somebody who's barricaded themselves in a room, has a gun, has hostages, I'm not in the room with that person. So I don't have the luxury of that 55%. I don't have the ability to say, if I'm negotiating with you, Sam, say something and see you kind of roll your eyes like, oh, what an idiot. I can't believe he said that to me. So we didn't have that. So we had to get good, certainly figuring things out based on what people were saying, but also what they weren't saying and how they were saying it. So I'll give you a couple examples. I'll give you one that's totally atypical. They never went this way. So I was working that night. We were not a full-time SWAT team. And I'll give you an idea how long ago this was. We carried pagers with us. And so when the pager went off, you called a number and you got the information on where to go. So I was working that night. I was in a marked car. I was a sergeant at the time. So I got to the scene pretty quickly. And I talking to the uniformed officers. I'm like, what's the deal? It's like, he's drunk. He's barricaded himself in his house with his wife as a hostage, and he's got a gun. I'm like, okay, do you have him on the phone? Yes, we do. All right, let me talk to him. So we started talking. And Sam, you never talked about solutions until hours, usually hours into the, because think about it. I mean, you're trying to develop trust because any good relationship, husband and wife, parent, child, boss, subordinate, the overarching theme is trust. If you don't trust those people, you're not going to have a good relationship with them. So we're trying to develop trust with an individual we've never met before. And in many cases, had no idea why we were there, why they did what they did. So we never talked about solutions, but I just had a gut feeling about this guy. And I said to him, what would it take for you to let your wife go and you to come out? And there was this long pause. And he said, give me a beer. And I was like, if I gave you a beer, do I have your word that your wife would be let go and that you would come out? He said, do I have your word I could drink it? I said, you absolutely have my word you could drink it, but do I have your word? He said, yeah, I'll let my wife go and I'll come out. So I gave $5 to one of the officers. I said, get out in the store, buy a beer. The tactical team put it on the front porch, and I called them back. And I said, your beer's on the front porch, but you don't get it until you let your wife go and you come out with your hands up. And he hit me again with, do I have your word I can drink it? And I said, you absolutely have my word. You can drink it. All of a sudden, the front door comes open. Here comes his wife. And then here he comes with his hands up. We handcuffed him and we let him drink his beer. And then off to jail he went. And one of the things I'll say about what we did is we never lied to people. So people would say to us all the time, hey, I'll put the gun down or I'll come out, but you've got to promise me I'm not going to go to jail. And we would have to say, I'm sorry, when you do come out, you are going to go to jail. And then we would try to deflect the conversation to something more positive. And the reason we did that, not because we were great people or anything like that, it's because there was a very good chance, and this happened several times, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we would be right back negotiating with the person because the underlying cause hasn't gone away. Maybe every time they talk to their mother, they go ballistic. Well, mom's still alive. They're still going ballistic. And 3 years later, we're back doing the same negotiation again. And if they ever felt we lied to them, that trust is out the window. You're going to have to bring another negotiator in to do that. So that was one scenario. This one was more serious. This was an individual who wanted to take their own life. Right. And this started probably around dinner time. And the person slit their wrists. And that didn't work for them. And somehow they got the brilliant idea to turn the gas on in their oven and stick their head in the oven. That didn't work either. And so they call a friend, or actually it was a relative. And the relative calls the police. And so it's probably 3 o'clock in the morning now. And I'm talking to this guy, and he's got a gun now. And finally, he just says, Terry, I'm really tired. I want to come out. I said, great. I said, come on out. I said, I'll come down to the scene. We'll talk face to face. We'll talk man to man. He's like, I'd really like that. And then I said, don't hang up the phone. Just bring the phone with you, but put the gun down. Well, he hung up the phone, which we're conditioned to do when a conversation's over. About 30 seconds later, one of the tactical officers comes on the radio and says, we heard a gunshot. And I thought, you didn't. He did. He shot himself in the head. But he shot himself. What we kind of think happened is it was kind of a hesitation shot. Like, I really don't want to do this. Boom. And the gun went off. And he shot himself at such an angle that the bullet went in right around his temple. But it went in at an angle, not like into your skull, but around your skull. It went around his skull and came out the other side. So got underneath the skin and came out the other side. An incredibly bloody wound, but not a very serious wound. And, we always talk about when it's your time to go, it's your time to go. But when it's not your time to go, it's not your time to go. So here's a guy who tried 3 times to kill himself. And I think it was just God's way of saying, you know what? Nope, sorry, not your time yet. You can do anything you want. You're not going to die tonight. And that. So those were just two incidences that we experienced.
For a few practical takeaways, obviously there's been tons throughout. For anyone listening, so they've heard you talk a bit about nutrition. Are there common nutritional mistakes that people might be doing that have quite an easy solution?
Totally. First one is people, in my opinion, should invest a good 1 to 3 months counting calories, purely to bring awareness to what you eat. And then you can stop counting calories and be able to freestyle your nutrition but with greater awareness. There's so many foods that are healthy, but actually really high in calorie. Like you might go, oh, we're going to have lamb this week. Lamb has 3 times more calories than chicken. That's not to say it's bad, but it's good to be aware, because let's say you're a female, 70 kilos, you only need 2,000 calories a day. If you eat a 200-gram lamb fillet, that's 600 calories. That's nearly a third of your daily intake just through a bit of meat that you're eating in the day. So I think that's a quick win. And yes, it takes a bit of time and you have to invest, a little bit of time and knowledge into that. But I think it pays big dividends. The second thing is really appreciating that real food is where it's at. Like you can get caught up reading labels and all this shit, but like try and eat real food most of the time. You're not going to go wrong. Meat, dairy, pulses, of course, exclude things that you might be reactive to and intolerant to. But meat, pulses, fish, vegetables, fruit, like when you go and study the people that live the longest in the world, the common denominator is they just eat real food. Some people might be eating low carb, some high carb, some high this, but they're all eating really good nutrient dense food. Like they're not having breakfast out of a box, end of. And the third thing is, I think culinary expertise is hugely underrated. So many people don't know how to cook well enough to keep a healthy diet interesting. So if I said to you, let's take chicken. How many ways can you cook chicken? And you might be like, oh, I can, I do this with it, I do that with it. And I'm like, right, so your repertoire of chicken is 4 dishes. That's not very expansive. That's not very interesting. Can we get you to a point where you can create a chicken dish 20 different ways? You can do 20 different things with salmon. You can do 20 different things with potatoes. And then all of a sudden, healthy food's exciting. It's like when you pick up a cookbook, it's not that often that a cookbook is unhealthy. They're usually actually quite healthy. They're just a bit complicated because there's quite often a lot of ingredients involved. And that's why I'm a huge fan of looking at like Mediterranean cuisine, because it's quite often beautifully simple. It's like, oh, we've got a chicken thigh. Let's marinate it in a bit of olive oil, bit of thyme, bit of lemon, leave it in the fridge overnight, bang it in the oven. Beautiful. And it's taken 4 ingredients. Then we've got some vegetables. We've got this. We need a bit of that. Boom. Like, who doesn't go to Europe and go, the food in Europe, so good. And it's so simple. Like we're not trying to cook, Thai food every week where it's a bit more complicated. There's a lot more ingredients. There's a bit more marinade and whatnot. So I think culinary expertise is really underrated. Me and my wife make it a mission that we try and cook a new dish every week, and that can be challenging sometimes, but it's enjoyable. Like we almost look forward to that new dish and like, oh yeah, cool, and then we either add it into our repertoire and we're like, nah, we thought that was okay, probably wouldn't cook that again. And I think people would just enjoy eating healthily because no one really dislikes real food. They dislike how boring it can become because of how bad they are at cooking healthy food in lots of different ways.
Yeah. And that's would you say that improving your culinary expertise is a trial and error thing? Is it just trying new dishes and learning, or is there anything else people can do?
Yeah, just putting in the effort. Like you can't ignore the effort that has to be made. So what I would say to people is order what you're going to order next week on your food order. Stick to like your routine. Do one new meal. And maybe one new lunch, and then do that. And at the end of the year, you've cooked 52 new and different dinners. That's already a lot. That already adds to your repertoire in a kind of big way. And if you could do that on an evening where you've got a bit more time, it's a bit less stressful. I get that, people coming in at 6 o'clock from work, they're running around, got kids to feed, whatever. Cooking a new dish can be a bit stressful because you need to pay attention. But if on a Friday night, you've got a bit more time, whatever, then perhaps that's the night to kind of try something new. And actually that becomes the focal point of the evening. Like, try something new. We'll eat up the table. We'll eat a bit differently. We'll get a new different pudding or whatever, whatever. But it's like anything in life. You've got to put a bit of effort in to get the reward.
For people listening who might be sort of interested in getting started, are there any sort of simple tips, anything that you could suggest that they start with?
Yeah, read the book. No, in all seriousness, so Pippin's Rich Life, as you've read, is just a fictional novel, right? It's just an easy read. But within there, it teaches some of those basic principles. It doesn't matter if you're 12, 20, 30, 40, 50. It doesn't matter. I've honestly had 60-year-olds read the book and have given the same feedback as 12-year-olds. I didn't know that. That's really interesting. I'm going to start doing that. I've actually recently had a 24-year-old feedback through various channels, baffled that she didn't know some of this stuff, and has just, knowing what she wants to achieve, has just started implementing some of the things. I would say the biggest thing and the first thing that the book goes into with the protagonist, Liam, tracking. You have to be able to know what's in and what's out.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the company that I'm currently working for is an IFA in London, now contracting as a business consultant. But I overheard in the staff room today the question, do you think you could live on X a month if you didn't have to pay, for kids, but you still have to pay for your bills and your lifestyle? Can you live on X a month? And it was like an open discussion. Yes, it was a hypothetical, but what it showed me, this was today in an IFA for people that are advisors, planners, administrators of financial advice, didn't have a clue where their money was going. Because if they knew what was going out, ignore what's coming in for now. If you know what's going out, you know what sections of your life you can cut. So if I just cut my housing and bills, how much am I spending a month? If I cut my lifestyle, eating out, holidays, how much am I spending a month? I know all those figures for me. I'm a bit odd in fact that I like the detail. But having a rough idea means that I know that within my eating out budget for the month, I have, say, £120 left for the rest of the month. I'm going out this evening. If that meal comes to £60, then I need to think about when I'm then planning to go out again. And if I go out again and I go over that budget and say I spend £200, I then need to recalculate where's that other £80 coming from? Because I'm not going to get paid another £80 more at the end of the month. So something needs to give.
Mm.
So understanding tracking, and therefore you get the understanding naturally of not just what's coming in. That's quite an easy one to track, really, unless you're sort of self-employed and it comes from all sources. Should still know that though. But what's going out? And group categories, and this is a lot of budgeting tools and expense trackers break it down into the granular. You do not need to understand and know your bank statement every month. You just don't. You need to know roughly how much do I spend on going out, whether that's social or eating out, or just group it into massive categories. My budget has 5 items in it. That's it.
What categories would those be?
So for me, travel, food main, so groceries.
Yep.
Food out, consumables and social. And that is it. If you're having any more than 5 categories in your budget, now there are other things. There's 3 sections to truly understanding your lifestyle. That's just the living budget, so the day-to-day expensive. You've then got fixed outgoings, which are different, monthly, annual expenses, or fortnightly, however they're structured. And then you've got what I call envelopes, and that is everything and this is the thing that people miss. even professional budgeters miss. We know this is the best example. We know Christmas comes around every single year, right? And yet we're all always like, oh no, I need to spend money on Christmas presents, and then spend January, February, and March paying it off. Why on earth do we do that? I know roughly, it might change, but I know roughly I need to spend on X, Y, Z people. I know I'm probably going to allocate them a budget of no change from last year. So I know roughly, let's say I need £600 for Christmas, all in. How about in January, I just put £50 a month into an envelope. Come December, I have £600 to spend on Christmas. If something happens through the year and I need to cut and that needs to come down because I've had to take that money out to pay something else that I didn't quite expect or hadn't planned well enough for, well, okay, I've taken £60 out of it, so everyone's budget comes down by 10%. The money's still there. So you can plan for literally everything in your life.
So mindset was, I looked at the enormity of rowing the Atlantic, and that's not like, walking up Butser Hill or anything like that. This is massive. So for me personally, I looked, and you learn this when you're out there. So I didn't want to win. My only goal was to help my mate out, because he's trusted me to do that, and I won't let him down, and to finish and get back to my family and my friends safe. And thirdly, to raise money, a massive amount of money for both charities. So that was my goals there. So in order to celebrate that, Stu's goal's the same. So Stu wanted to get to the end of a row, look like Robinson Crusoe, give his wife a big hug, and the world thinks, me and Stu are great, which is fine, and enjoy your success. I'm not going to take that away from Stu. But he's a destination guy. I thought that doesn't work for me, because however long that gap is, if it's 50 days, and as it was, if it was 65 days or 64 days to get across, then I don't reward myself at all for that length of time. So Stu now set himself up that he has to grind out and work probably the hardest he's done and be the lowest he's been for 64 days before he says that he's done well. And I thought that doesn't work for me. So I promised myself every 2 hours that I rowed, my mindset was, I'm going to reward myself after every 2 hours. So I'm going to go out, I'm going to be disciplined, I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to do the best shift I can do. Yeah. And after that 2 hours, I'm going to physically say out loud, Sads, that's a good shift. And in the back of my mind, I would then know I've given a good account of myself. There's less rowing strokes to do. So I've chipped away at that massive mountain. There's less strokes to do. And no matter what, except the storm lockdown days, I'll be closer to my destination than I was prior to my shift. So I rewarded myself 12 times a day, and I said it out loud. Probably annoyed Stu with that. She said, Sads, well done. That's a great shift. Yeah. And even when you're low, so we had a repeater on the cabin, as you look at, a black box that should have told us our direction and speed, but we had no power. And mentally, so the biggest influence for me in my life would have been my granddad, really. And I miss him dearly every day. But I changed my boat into Big Brother. This is sound lunacy. That's a camera watching me, and my granddad is watching every stroke. So I can't fail. I cannot cheat and sit there and pretend I'm pulling. I'm going to pull every stroke because I want to get to the finish line. So I was honest with that. So I rewarded myself 12 times a day, out loud, pat on the back, and Stu never rewarded himself. I did. I said, Stu, that's hell of a shift. Look at the distance we've come. But it's water for ducks back to him because he needs to get to the finish. He's a destination guy. So are you a journey guy or are you a destination guy? And it came together smack bang on halfway. So when we did 1,500 miles, we downed the oars and we saved a can of Coke each and a tube of Pringles, ready salted. And we sat there, and it's a real strange discussion. We were both chuffed to bits, and Stu was elated then. So it was a sort of a half celebration for Stu. And Stu said, Sads, we're smashing it. We've got 1,500 miles to go, mate. We got this. And I turned around to Stu and said, mate, I'm celebrating completely the opposite, mate. I said, Stu, we've done 1,500 miles, mate. Look behind and how far we've come for 1,500 miles. I said, that's a superb achievement. Anything from here is all downhill. Technically it's not, but, and he said, so we had two complete, I'm looking one way, looking how far we've come, and he's looking the other way of how far we've got to go, but both celebrating the same moment at 1,500 miles. So hence why probably when I reflect back, and it's only just dawned on me now, is why the finish was a bit overwhelming in that. I'd had so many celebrations of success throughout my row, and Stu didn't. So that's why he probably enjoyed the finish.
Yeah,
a
every
lot more
2-hour
than
shift was a success.
sort of I did, yeah.
It sort of makes me think of one of my favourite books is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Short book, but he was taken to the prisoner camps in World War II. So he spent 3 years in various concentration camps. And he spoke about mindset in that. So I think there was a Christmas, I think it was the Christmas of 44. So obviously just coming up to the year before the war ended. But few people in camp had started to hear about the Allies getting closer and that it would be done by Christmas and they'd be freed. And they set that in their mind. So they were thinking, okay, we're going to be free by Christmas. And he was a very, I don't know what the word, maybe you could say stoic in a way, but he's very much just every present moment, I'm just going to act out. I have the choice to decide how I act in this moment. And that's his mindset. And that's one of the big takeaways from that book. But when that time came and Christmas passed and the Allies weren't there, and then the next few weeks passed, these people actually started to die, like it was almost like he was saying, like, because they just lost hope and they'd because they'd set their mind so strong on that time. As it started to pass, they just lost hope and they stopped eating, and they just, quite a lot of them started to just die, unfortunately. But yeah, obviously it's slightly different.
No,
I 100%.
Yeah.
I sort of, it sort of made me think of that, and that just taken in the moment.
Absolutely.
And obviously, like in your case, where you're expecting it to be 50 days, potentially those last few extra days, maybe in Stu's mind wasn't sort of expecting, and it could have been a lot harder. And even if it went even longer, how that would have affected him potentially.
That's completely relatable to Stu, because he would be monitoring on a tracker. There's a tracker you can follow all boats and individual teams and stats and stuff. And he's so competitive. He was competitive with every other pair that was rowing.
Oh, really?
And if they made more miles than us, he'd be fuming.
Yeah.
So to manage that, I knew that we were in an old boat, and you get to choose your route across. You can do a northerly route, a southerly route, a mid route, whatever you choose. Once you leave Tenerife, you get one coordinate you have to go under, and then how you get across is entirely up to you. And I said, Stu, you're investing too much time in worrying about other things that are out of your control, So I had to not manage Stu, but I would give him, Stu needs to be doing stuff. So let's have a look if we can get rid of any mouldy food, or do we need to carry 20 litres of water? Why don't we carry 10? That's, 15 litres less weight. And how could we, should we jump out and clean the hole a bit more frequently than once a week? Or all of these things for him to think about, which sort of ease that pain. He said, right, we're going to clean the hole twice a week now. Yeah, cool, that'll speed us up, or let's trim the boat a little bit better. We're a bit bow heavy. Let's move some stuff to the stern, or let's trim it and let's balance it right. And right, is there anything else we can jettison? Like all the food that's ruined, put in the sea, the fish will have that. Not wrappers. It's a clean crossing, and they're very, very strict on that. You can't pollute at all. So I had to give Stu things to work on to make it less painful for him, because he's that guy. We should 50 days. We should be in by now. It doesn't matter. We're not. So that's out of our control. Let's keep grinding out.
Yeah.
And I'd say to him every day, Stu, be consistent and be honest, and we'll get there, mate. We'll get there. We'll get there when it goes back to my comment. We'll get there when the Atlantic wants us to get there, mate, not when you want to.
There might be people listening who are trying to build muscle. What are some of the main sort of misconceptions about building muscle that people might be missing?
I think the biggest one is they think they have to just stuff themselves and force feed. We know that's not true now. We have like a fair amount of research that's coming out that kind of suggests, you don't need to eat as much as a lot of these old school bodybuilders tell you need to, and people kind of miss the whole link between these guys are on performance enhancing drugs. So the things they do, a lot of these things are going to work kind of regardless. They're doing this and they're getting a lot of progress kind of despite what they're doing rather than because of what they're doing. And a lot of them are a lot better now, but some of the old school advice, especially, terrible. You listen to some of the things that come out of like Arnold's mouth and it's like, yeah, he's a genetic freak who took performance enhancing drugs. Of course it worked for him. So I think the first one is force feeding and stuff. Like I wouldn't go anywhere near that. Most people, if you eat your maintenance calories, which is the amount of calories that you need to maintain your current weight, and you add about 5% to that, generally you're going to be okay. Just do it for a long period of time. Second thing, leading off that, is muscle building is an excruciatingly slow process after you're finished with your newbie gains phase. So please take your fucking time when you're trying to build muscle. Stop trying to build as much muscle in 4 weeks as possible, getting really fat, getting scared of gaining body fat, and then cutting again. Like, give it time. My best results with clients usually come from them spending 9 to 12 months in a surplus at a time. We just do it incrementally and we aim to gain a very small amount of weight per week. And we also don't use gaining phases as an excuse to just go and eat everything you want all the time. You still try to pay attention to, like the 80-20 rule I really like, where 80% of the stuff you eat, single ingredient whole foods that are good for you, 20% of the stuff you eat, really good for the soul. You like it, you enjoy it, like for me, for example, before this podcast, I ate a Turkish Delight bar. I know that's a very controversial chocolate choice, but I like Turkish Delight, so I had one. And then I'm going to have steak and salad after this for dinner tonight. That's how I live my life. I like it. I enjoy it. I have balance that way. The third thing? Yeah, I think I'm on third thing. Yeah. Whatever. The next thing, numerically, whatever value we're on. You guys listening to this, you just got to train harder, man. Like so many people do not train hard enough, and they train to there's a running joke in the fitness industry of training to mild discomfort. And I love that saying so much. And that's where a lot of people are at. And it's like, you don't have to bone crushingly destroy yourself every training session to make progress, but you do probably have to train to the point where you start making some less than savory facial expressions, where you do start to question what dimension you're in. And you do maybe need to realize you probably should go pee before you start your working set rather than trying to hold it, like those sort of things. And it's training to within what we call like 2 to 3 RIR, so 2 to 3 reps in reserve, meaning that if you were to take a set of squats and you were to go all out to the point where you couldn't stand up anymore, that would be considered muscular failure. We want to stop the set probably 2 reps before we hit that, because then we have all these what we call stimulating reps, which come towards the end of a hard set, which are the ones that really matter the most because they have the most amount of significant tension placed on the muscle. They're the ones where you slow down as you're trying to move the weights, like a bench press. You're pressing it up and it's involuntarily slowing down. You're like, oh my God, am I going to get this? Those are the reps that matter. But hanging away from completely failing and dropping barbells on your head and all that sort of stuff just minimizes the risk of injury and also helps you recover, because you need to recover between sessions. And I think then the last thing I would say that's a very common misconception is that you probably don't want to be training every single day. You will get more out of training 3 to 5 times a week than you ever will out of 6 to 7 times a week. And that was a really hard pill for me to swallow a few years back, because I loved training every single day. I was like, sleep is for the weak, rest is for pussies, blah, blah, blah. But it's true that, the best results I get with clients are generally the clients that train 4 or 5 times a week. They train really hard and then they rest and recover and they take their time to do that. I myself train 5 days a week, but one of my days is, I injured my knee a few months ago. One of my days is very fluffy, rehabby sort of stuff. So really, it's 4 hard workouts a week, and that's about it, really. So to kind of TLDR that, don't go on a dreamer bulk because you don't need to. A small surplus is always going to win. On top of that, make sure that you're spending enough time trying to build muscle. Don't try and cram it all into the one go. And then also make sure that you train hard enough, because if you're going to do that, that means that you don't have to train as many days a week. You also don't have to do as many sets in a session, and you can kind of condense things, focus more on quality over quantity. And if you don't know who I am before this podcast, I'm sure my Instagram will be linked down below. You can come get some tips off that, because that's literally all I do. I'm the biggest training nerd, and it's basically my entire personality, which makes dating very difficult.
Yeah, that's a really nice little overview of a few of the things that people will probably be suffering with, and a lot of the time not even knowing it. So I think hopefully that will help one or two people at least. And in terms of nutrition, you sort of mentioned it a few times. So
Yeah.
just touch on that, and how does nutrition link in with that?
So in terms of building muscle, one of the key things that we need are amino acids, which we get from proteins. You may have heard the typical, like, protein is the building block of muscle. Yeah, and it's true. So if you want to build muscle, you need to be eating ample amounts of protein, which everyone used to think was like 3 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is insane. But I used to do that myself because that's what everybody thought. It's now probably more like 1.7 to 2 grams per kilo of body weight. So again, I mentioned before, I'm 90 kilos body weight. I eat roughly about 180 grams of protein a day minimum. And that's not like weighing a chicken breast and seeing that it's 180 grams of chicken. That's 180 grams of the macronutrient protein. And if you're confused on what that is, just Google macronutrients. You'll find a really good explanation for that on Google at the top of the search. It's okay. Or again, come follow me on Instagram. I'll explain it for you. DM me. We also require enough calories to be able to perform. Okay, so when we look at calories, calories are a unit of measurement that we use to measure energy from food. So anyone who doesn't know that, it's kilojoules, right? It's the heat that we take out of food. It's a measurement. We need calories to perform well. And if we want to build muscle, we need to perform well. We need to be progressing. Even if it's not every single week, it's every couple of weeks. We're seeing increases in the amount of kilograms that we're lifting, or the amount of reps that we're doing with the same kilograms. So eating enough calories gives you enough energy to do that, enough fuel in the tank to be able to do that. So my overview for nutrition for people is just to make sure that you're finding a system that works for you. And it doesn't have to be tracking calories, but like, make sure that you are eating enough food, which probably means for most people eating at least kind of 3 decent sized meals per day, whereby you're having a mixture of foods that are, again, whole foods. You want protein, so chicken, steak, egg whites, Greek yogurt, protein powder in oats or something like that. Or if you're vegetarian or vegan, hard cheeses, tempeh, tofu, beans, lentils, all these sorts of things, really good. You want carbs, but you want kind of, I hate calling them good carbs, but let's call them clean carbs.
Yep.
So things like potatoes, rice, sweet potato, all that sort of stuff. You want veggies on your plate. Fats, try and get them from fish, from fattier cuts of meat, from avocado, from nuts, from things like that. And then once you've kind of got those as the basis of your meals, make sure you eat something every single day that you like. And if you're someone who really loves eating clean, it might be that the thing that you really like eating is just beetroot or something. And I ain't judging for that. Like, for me, for ages, it was pineapple. I was downloading like a massive tub of pineapple every single day. And I'm like, people be like, that's clean. I'm like, yeah, I know. But that was my treat to myself. It was sweet. I love it.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's just doing something for yourself each day. And I find especially people who demonize foods, because I used to do this myself a lot. The more you make that food accessible, the less you're going to demonize it, and the less you're going to, because the more you're going to realize like, oh, this thing doesn't actually fuck with my progress long term, So like, for example, if you think that cookies are really bad for fat loss, but you can fit a cookie into your calorie expenditure, for the next couple of days, eat a cookie every single day and let's see what happens. And I guarantee you that if you're accurate on the food that you're meant to be eating alongside that cookie, you will lose body fat, and you'll be like, I can eat cookies. And then you're going to get really bored of cookies, and they're never going to give you any problem again, because you're basically getting forced to eat them every single day. And you're like, I don't want a cookie. You're going to fucking eat the cookie. I don't
Trick
want
your
it.
mind
Like,
out of it.
yeah, exactly, man. So, my hypothesis around nutrition is always to try and, eat as many whole foods as you can. But, life is there to be lived at the end of the day. Like, Christmas is coming up. For anyone who celebrates Christmas, if you're tracking calories and macros on Christmas, what the fuck you doing?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I think 100%. I think, again, it sort of goes back to something you were saying earlier about how clients are very different, and they've got their own lives to live. People are busy, and you might see someone online saying you need 6 meals a day at these exact times, this far apart, this amount of protein per. It's like, people have lives to live. People are like working. People have got to get to the gym in the evening, look after their kids, look after their dog, whatever it is. it's like, yeah. So it's nice to sort of hear that you can be adaptive with it, but by looking at those sort of staples, I suppose, and just making sure that you get the basics right, and then working from there.
Adaptive is a good word. I like it.
Yeah. And I think with, like the cookie thing as well, just understanding that what is it they say, like there's not bad foods, but there's like bad habits, I suppose, or bad decisions. If you're continuously eating the A thing multiple times, that's when it becomes a bad thing.
Yeah. And if you're giving it power too, if you're giving it power over your emotions, so if you're getting emotional, you're getting stressed, you're getting upset, and that's making you turn to food, and then that food is making you even more angry, even more upset, even more stressed, because now you feel like you've become less of a person because you couldn't resist the food, that's when it becomes a problem. You know, like, tell you what, like, this is just making me want a cookie though, I can't lie.
That's something that I feel really passionate about, is it troubles me when there's sort of this, I very much think that there's huge diversity in men. So it's very difficult to talk about, I've spoken to men who've had amazing experiences in therapy, men that really didn't like it. Same with medication. There's men that think still have these ideas that going for help is a weakness. There's lots of men who are absolutely desperate for help and they can't afford it, or there's long waiting lists. So there's huge diversity in men and male behavior. But I really, really, that what you've said about the bricks going into the bag is so important, because that is the human experience. Doesn't matter what your gender is. Like, painful things happen in a physical, biological, psychological being, and they have a legacy. So for me, encouraging men to be have more cultural permission to be able to understand emotionally what has happened to them. I really don't like it when there's a suggestion that that's an attempt to feminize women, because it's not. The emotions aren't something that just belong to women. They're part of the human experience. That bag of bricks, every person has. You can't escape it. And so for me, it's really, really important that gets framed in that way. Does that make sense?
Yes, helping everyone understand we are all the same. We all have that same experience of that thing, but there is also the nuances of each gender, I suppose, and everyone is going to have a different experience. And even within that gender, I suppose, like you said before, there's such a wide range of humans. So when you're looking at men or women, you can't just generalize everything, because some men will be okay going and sitting down and talking to someone. Some men would rather go and run up a mountain, and just that would be their way of dealing with something.
And the point being that when something difficult happens, and because by virtue of being human beings, we have emotional responses to that, and so encouraging men to have more sort of cultural permission to have that emotional response, however they then sort of want to express it, is not to try and make them more feminine in behavior, but to try and help them access the fullness of their humanity, because that emotional response to difficult things happening is part of being a human being.
Yeah. How do you think we got to the point where it is, for men, it is that feeling of just being told, just deal with it, whereas women are allowed to feel their emotions maybe more from a society standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And I think it's really difficult I think so many different ingredients go into how those sort of cultural ideas emerge and then what sustains them. I did read something really interesting, and I can't remember who wrote it, but they were talking about, they sort of rooted the cultural emergence of these ideas back to the point in history where we moved from kind of living in small communities, living off the land, and it was much more potentially kind of more people doing relatively similar roles in a way. And then when we became more urbanized and industrialized, and suddenly we had this heavy industry, we had large scale wars, and they suggested that there was sort of a cultural value for society as a whole for men to be encouraged to sort of disassociate from their emotions, because if you're asking a group of the population to do jobs that endanger their lives, to go to wars that may endanger their lives, there's potentially a value for society in getting that group of people to sort of feel like they can't talk about their pain, to be fearless.
Yeah.
Which I found really, really kind of interesting. And I really liked it, I suppose, because it was looking at how we've all potentially benefited from these ideas and norms in some way. Instead of, sometimes I think the conversation can be like, men have somehow done it to themselves, like they and so for me, sort of that contextualization can be really important. But I mean, it's impossible. It's a very difficult question to kind of answer. But I think once those ideas take hold and they become kind of, most of us on some level want to belong, with this human need to want to belong. And so we can, I'm not saying everybody does, but we can often do the behaviors that give us that safety of belonging to what the majority is telling us is required. But my work very much looks at, when I talk about cultural norms of masculinity, I'm very much talking about these ideas and beliefs and attitudes and expectations that exist externally to men, that I think sometimes can be harmful for men. I'm absolutely never talking about something that's inherent inside of you, Sam, by virtue of being a man, that is kind of harmful for you or a toxic thing. Like, for me, that's not what the evidence I see is saying at all.
What are some of those external things that you would look at in that scenario?
So I would say that there are sort of three really key external things that I think of. If you imagine like suicidal pain as a kind of chord on the piano,
right?
I would say that there's kind of key notes in those chords, and those notes relate to sort of unmet needs or pain in key psychological areas. And I think that potentially those notes are the same irrespective of gender. But I think because of these cultural norms of masculinity, men may be at more risk of feeling pain in relation to those notes, if that makes sense. So the first note is around your relationship with your emotions. And I think that's probably intuitively the one that we would, that most people would reach for, and that this idea of male emotional suppression and how that can then impact some men's, first of all, ability to identify for themselves what they're feeling, what's going on for them. And then, of course, limiting some men's ability to feel like they can express what they're feeling to other people, and then getting into these situations where it's building up inside, not getting sort of any meaningful processing or release, and reaching that point of feeling sort of these overwhelmingly painful emotions. The second note, I think, is around our relationship with ourselves. So how we think and feel about ourselves, how you think and feel about Sam, how I think and feel about Susie. And we see again how sort of cultural norms of male success and expectations for who men should be in the world, and then these feelings of failure that can come then if you feel like you're not hitting those markers. And that was a huge thing for me, Sam, as a woman doing this work, like really early on, to get my head around how fucking enormous those feelings of failure can be for some men, how and I found it so moving. And then some men speaking about feeling like a failure, but then almost sort of creating this, we call it like a performance of self, because they didn't feel able to tell anyone about those feelings, and so they would get into these situations performing to the outside world that they were happy, in control, and then this sort of, first of all, how exhausting that is to do that performance, and then second of all, how lonely it is, as this gulf kind of emerges between how you're externally presenting and what you're feeling on the inside. So we also saw then these sort of, that was a sort of second note in terms of painful feelings that you have towards yourself. And then that third note and that chord of suicidal pain is often around our relationships with other people. And again, we sort of see the impact of these cultural norms of masculinity for men to be independent, to suppress your emotions, to be in control, to be self-reliant. All of those ideas impact then how you build meaningful connections with other people. It's much harder in a way to be meaningfully connected to somebody that you're not revealing your,
Full self to.
your full self to. So often I speak to men that are feel deeply, deeply isolated, deeply alone. And sometimes these are men who are visibly excluded from the world. They don't seem to have many close people around them. And other men that are really seemingly have many people around them, and yet within those dynamics feel incredibly kind of emotionally isolated. So in that chord of suicidal pain, you've got this note about your relationship with your emotions, this note about your relationship with yourself, and then this note about relationships with other people. And I think that these norms of masculinity can increase sort of men's pain in those three areas.
If you haven't already followed the podcast or rated the podcast, wherever you're listening, if you could do that, that really helps me just reach new people, spread the word and spread the information. That's what we're trying to do. You can also follow me on Instagram at Lonely Chapter Podcast. And lastly from me, thank you for listening.